Love that backdrop. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm Philomena Tassi, Minister responsible for the Federal Economic Development Agency for Southern Ontario. I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered here in Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. So just before we begin, as you all know, there may be a vote at any time in the House. So if that is the case, I'm going to ask that you excuse us. We absolutely will have time for media Q&A, and I know the media here today is in touch with Minister Wilkinson's press team. So thank you for excusing us in advance if, in fact, we need to take that liberty. So look, I am so pleased to join all of you this morning for this very exciting occasion as our government works to put Canada on the path to long-term growth and prosperity. So I am joined by a fantastic group this morning. The Minister of Natural Resources of Canada, Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister of Labour, Seamus O'Regan, Minister of Sport and Minister responsible for the Federal Economic Development Agency of Canada for the regions of Quebec, Pascal Saint-Onge, Minister of Tourism and Associate Minister of Finance, Randy Boissonnault, NDP Member of Parliament for Elmwood-Transcona, Daniel Blaikie, President of the Canadian Labour Congress, Bia Brusk, and other representatives from IUOE and IBEW, and the Western Regional Director for Unifor, Gavin McGarrigle. So we are gathered here today to talk about our plan for securing sustainable jobs right here in Canada for generations to come. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to hand the microphone over to my friend and colleague, Minister Jonathan Wilkinson. Jonathan.
Bonjour à tous et merci d'être ici aujourd'hui. Partout dans le monde, des entreprises, grandes et petites, des syndicats et des gouvernements sont dans une course pour réduire les émissions de carbone, saisir des opportunités économiques extraordinaires et éviter les effets destructeurs du changement climatique. Global financial markets are driving many of these changes, with investors looking to steer away from investments that are not consistent with a low-carbon future and towards those that are. Successful businesses must learn to adapt to changes in the business environment. It is what their shareholders expect. It is what their employees depend upon. Governments are no different. To effectively serve their citizens, they must also respond to changing circumstances and then take decisive actions. The economic future of Canadians depends on us making smart choices about how we move forward. The good news is that Canada is extraordinarily well positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that will come through the transition to a low-carbon future. We have very significant areas of comparative advantage that are going to be relevant in such a world. It is up to us to make the smartest possible choices. Canada can choose to be a leader in the context of moving forward, or we can effectively stick our heads in the sand and decide that we will let the world pass us by. Going slower and just hoping for the best is a choice, but it is a much riskier choice. There are essentially two paths that we can take. The first path accepts that climate change is a reality, a scientific reality, one that we can and that we must address. It accepts that the world as a whole is heading very much in this direction. The second path starts with shrugging off the damage that climate change has already caused and is causing. Floods in our towns and cities, the melting of our glaciers, dried up rivers, and of course, the forest fires that we are seeing across the country right now. It pretends that climate change is a fad that will fade and that we really don't need to do anything in order to keep our economy healthy for the long term. I am optimistic that if we choose the first path, and certainly this government has chosen the first path, that there are major opportunities that are available if we are thoughtful and we are strategic. I am concerned that if Canada were to adopt the second path, it would not only harm our environment, but it would mean we would lose competitiveness economically. I think of the first path as a plan for the future, a thoughtful plan for the future, and the second path of being simply hoping for the best. A thoughtful plan for the future includes at least 4 key areas of focus. Firstly, seizing those types of economic opportunities that are presented by this shift to net zero: hydrogen, critical minerals, renewable energies, small modular reactors, a whole range of opportunities that exist for Canada. Secondly, a thoughtful approach to ensuring the competitiveness of Canada's conventional energy in a low-carbon world. Thirdly, a commitment to deploy a clean, reliable and affordable electricity grid that can provide the power required to reduce emissions and to enable economic prosperity. And fourthly, ensuring meaningful Indigenous engagement and economic participation. Each of these four pillars provides support to Canada's businesses, enabling them to grow and to create jobs across the country. They are intended very much to be pursued in partnership with provinces and territories. And these four pillars have something else in common: Canada's workers. Without workers with the right skills in the right place at the right time, Canada's plan for economic growth and emissions reductions cannot succeed. And that is why today I am very pleased to have tabled in the House of Commons the government's Sustainable Jobs Act. Ce projet de loi s'appuie sur le plan provisoire pour des emplois durables que nous avons publié plus tôt cette année. Ce plan a marqué le début d'un processus itératif visant à tracer la voie vers une prospérité inclusive au Canada à mesure que le bouquet énergétique évolue dans le monde. C'était un plan qui inclut tout le monde, un plan basé sur les commentaires des travailleurs, des communautés, des entreprises, des peuples autochtones, des provinces et des territoires canadiens. This plan spoke to the work to be done to seize the economic opportunities that will be enabled through the shift to a low-carbon future. As I say, Canada is enormously well positioned to take advantage of these opportunities. In the interim Sustainable Jobs Plan, we outlined 10 federal actions to support the creation of sustainable jobs in every region of this country, including several institutional actions that will ensure ongoing work to create this prosperous future and to create good jobs. 4 of those actions were, firstly, establishing legislation that will ensure ongoing engagement and accountability. Secondly, creating a Sustainable Jobs Partnership Council to provide the government with independent advice on sustainable job creation. Thirdly, publishing a Sustainable Jobs Action Plan every 5 years, beginning in 2025, to put in place measures to invest in the net zero emissions economy and the skills of the future. And fourthly, establishing a Sustainable Jobs Secretariat within the federal government to enable policy and program coherence across federal entities. Today's tabling of the Sustainable Jobs legislation advances all 4 of these key actions. The legislation itself is necessary because it will ensure that future governments will continue to focus on supporting Canada's workers in a changing global economy. Similar to the Net Zero Accountability Act, this will put into place structures, guidelines, and accountability mechanisms to ensure Canadians can judge the actions of this and future governments in this space. It advances the objectives set out in the interim plan, which itself brings together existing and planned efforts to drive progress, including measures recently announced in the budget. It is intended to stimulate ongoing external input as well as further discussions with provinces and territories as we drive towards the development of the first complete Sustainable Jobs Action Plan in 2025. This legislation is focused on items within federal jurisdiction. We will, of course, continue to partner with every province and territory on building a prosperous economy that creates and maintains good, sustainable jobs. As I have often said, Canada's approach to sustainable jobs is about creating and maintaining jobs in every part of this country. It is one part of a broad set of initiatives, including the government's Clean Industrial Strategy outlined in Budget 2023, to seize the historic economic opportunities associated with building a net zero economy. Together with our partners here today, we are advancing a plan for the future. We are not simply hoping for the best. It is complex, and so it should be. It requires that we work together. Il s'agit d'une économie qui fonctionnera pour tout le monde, y compris les milliers de travailleurs canadiens de l'énergie dont les compétences et l'esthétique de travail contribueront à façonner notre succès. Overall, a clear-eyed and thoughtful plan for the future is about a national effort to pass on an environment and an economy that will help our children and our children's children to flourish for many decades to come. I would like to thank my colleagues who have joined me here today, our union partners whose collaboration and ambition have informed much of this work, the business community that has weighed in and been part of the consultations, our colleagues across the aisle in the House of Commons, in particular the members of the New Democratic Party, and in particular my counterpart Charlie Angus, who have contributed significantly to this legislation, and the provinces and territories and Indigenous partners who have also contributed through the consultations to get to where we are today. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. It is a good day, another step forward, and now I'd like to pass it on to Member of Parliament Daniel Blaikie for a few comments.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis heureux d'être ici pour l'introduction de cette importante législation. Les néo-démocrates réclament cette loi depuis longtemps parce qu'elle inscrit dans la loi la responsabilité du gouvernement fédéral à clairement veiller à ce qu'aucun travailleur ni aucune communauté ne soit laissé pour compte dans la création d'une économie net zéro. Je tiens à remercier B et le CTC ainsi que Gavin et Unifor pour leur leadership dans ce dossier extrêmement important. Je tiens également à remercier le ministre Wilkinson pour avoir travaillé de manière constructive avec Charlie Angus sur ce projet de loi. Il était vraiment important pour les néo-démocrates que cette législation soit incluse dans l'accord de confiance et d'approvisionnement, car nous savons que l'industrie et les chefs d'entreprise se portent toujours bien malgré les changements économiques. Ils prennent les décisions qui s'imposent pour continuer à faire de gros profits. Mais ce sont souvent les travailleurs et les communautés qui finissent par en payer le prix. Et dans le passé, les gouvernements successifs n'ont pas réussi à soutenir correctement les travailleurs lors de changements dans notre économie. L'NPD estime que la meilleure façon de s'assurer que le gouvernement est bien préparé à soutenir les travailleurs et les communautés est de faire participer les travailleurs et en particulier les syndicats dans l'élaboration du plan et des mesures à mettre en place. C'est eux qui ont l'expertise nécessaire et qui savent le plus ce dont ils ont besoin. Il était important pour nous que cette législation garantisse que les syndicats aient une voix forte lorsque le gouvernement élabore le plan et les services destinés à soutenir les travailleurs et les communautés. Bien que cette législation ne soit pas parfaite et qu'il reste du travail à faire, l'NPD croit que ce projet de loi est beaucoup meilleur pour les travailleurs parce que l'NPD y a contribué. Nous continuerons à travailler avec les travailleurs et les partenaires syndicaux pour veiller à ce qu'elle répond aux besoins des travailleurs et de leur communauté. In English, I'm very happy to be here today for the unveiling of this legislation. Too often when we've seen times of major economic transition, workers get left behind. And we know that workers today in Canada are concerned about being left behind. And that's because usually governments listen to deep-pocketed investors. Those are the people who get access to government decision makers. What we've done with this legislation and why it was important for the NDP to make it a priority in the Supply and Confidence Agreement was to ensure that labour leaders like B. Brusk from the CLC today and Gavin from Unifor are at the table and in the room when those decisions are being taken, because they're the ones who are accountable to workers. They're the ones that know the struggles of workers on job sites, and they're the ones who understand what it's going to take to successfully transition in a way that ensures that the benefit of Canada getting in at the ground floor on the new energy economy isn't just for international investors that want to take Canada's wealth home in dividends, but that wealth stays here and is a real benefit for Canadian workers and helps build stronger Canadian communities and ultimately restores Canada's middle-class economy. So that's what this legislation is about. We believe there is more work to do, but that this is a good start. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the work of my colleague Charlie Angus in working with Minister Wilkinson to improve the legislation, an effort that I know will continue as the bill works its way through the House of Commons. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. All right. Indulge me for a moment because I just wanted to say we lost a number of very excellent journalists yesterday, and I just wanted to mention those that I had worked with. Danielle Hamanjan, Paul Workman, Joyce Napier, Glenn McGarrigle, Rosa Wang, who's executive producer of CTV National News, Ian Woods, who I was just talking to the other day, and Tom Walters. Someday, I hope to be able to grow up and write as well as Tom Walters. These are excellent journalists that we are going to be missing, and it's a loss. But I do wish them all the best in whatever future plans they may have. They are so talented, so good, and so experienced. They will, I know, find some way to contribute. I also wanted to commend Alex, Corrine, Larry, and of course Bea from the Canadian Labour Congress for being here today. It's very important. Gavin and Sarah from Unifor, Matt's here from the IBEW, and Stephen from Operating Engineers. President Biden has called this an inflection point. He did when he was here, and he has many times. But this green industrial revolution that is theoretically talked about is a reality. Jonathan and I were just a couple of weeks ago in Come By Chance, Newfoundland, and there's a refinery there that looks like something out of Mad Max, but we are turning it into sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel. Like, it's happening. There are 1,000 people who are right now working on it. We went to Argentia, which is a coastal community in Placentia Bay, and an old American Air Force base with a runway that it's a brownfield site that they are going to turn into a monopile manufacturing area that is going to supply offshore wind turbines for the entire eastern seaboard. This is happening. The race is on. Right now, companies are trying to decide where to invest and where to build. So today is about setting Canadian workers up to seize those opportunities so that we can build the electric vehicles and the hydrogen plants and the renewable energy industries that the world wants and wants to build here in Canada. These jobs are on the table, and they are good jobs. Look at the tax credits that we just launched this year, $80 billion in clean tech tax credits to build up the industry, and to get the full benefit of those clean tax credits, to get the full benefit, the hook, is companies have to hire union workers or pay workers a prevailing union wage. That is a big deal. We are making sure that the green industry, energy industry in this country is built by workers with good jobs, with union jobs. Oh, and by the way, thanks to those clean tax credits, Canada is now the #2 place in the world for investors who want to put their money into green energy. We went from 6 to 2 overnight. The plan's working. There's been a lot of politicizing and, frankly, misinformation about the Sustainable Jobs Plan with this legislation. Let me tell you, when you grow up on a rock in the middle of the North Atlantic like I did, you can't afford ideology. You grow up seeing the world as it is, not as you want it to be. You see it clearly, and as it adapts, you adapt with it, and you prosper from it. This is what good governance is, and this is what we're doing. Industry understands that the world is looking for green energy, for renewables, for biofuels, for hydrogen, for solar power. So we can sit on our hands and let those industries be built in other countries, letting workers in other countries get those good jobs, or we can get in on the ground floor and make sure that workers here get those jobs, that it's Canadian workers who are selling clean energy to the world and taking home the profits. With that, I am going to hand it over to Bea and Gavin, 2 union leaders who have been absolutely instrumental in this process. We have worked hand in glove with unions right across this country, and I think we've come up with a much better piece of legislation as a result.
Thank you, Minister Wilkinson, Minister Qualtrough, and Minister O'Regan. It's a pleasure to be here today. The Canadian Labour Congress represents workers right across Canada. We represent the millions of workers who power our economy. Canada's unions were very happy to work with the ministers to make the Sustainable Jobs Act a reality. This bill lays out a roadmap for how Canada will address climate change and how we're going to future-proof our jobs and our industries. It's a framework for how Canada will keep pace with the US and countries right across the globe as the world transitions to the new low-carbon economy. We know that climate change is real and it's getting worse, and that we have to act. We see it with every new wildfire, we see it with every new air quality warning, and we see it with every new storm coming our way. This Sustainable Jobs Act is an absolutely critical piece of our climate change fight. I'm most excited that it puts labour, industry, and governments at the decision-making tables to work in unison together, because we know that we have to work together. We have to work together to deliver the vital growth opportunities, the training opportunities that industries need and that employees need to be able to move to low-carbon jobs. We also need to make sure that we work together to make sure that we get those skills training opportunities so that workers can take on new roles and new jobs. And only by working together can we build those new, good, sustainable family and community supporting jobs, good union jobs. And we also have a once-in-a-generation chance to create new opportunities to include women, Indigenous workers, racialized workers, and workers living with a disability, those who have been excluded from the labour market for many, many years. A partnership of unions, businesses, and governments, that is how we can give Canada a very competitive advantage in the world. And that's how our economy can keep pace for years to come. We know that the stakes are incredibly high. Hundreds of thousands of workers, jobs that are depending on this, billions of dollars of investments. The future of our communities hangs in the balance here. And if we fail, our workers, our industries, and our communities will be left behind as the US and as the rest of the world moves beyond us. So we are home to some of the best workers in the world. We know Canadian workers have skill and experience that they bring to the table, and we know that we have what we need to make Canada flourish. So on behalf of Canada's workers, we look forward to continuing to work closely with each of you to get this right, because we know that together we can build prosperous and sustainable communities for generations to come. Thank you.
Thanks, Bea. My name is Gavin McGarrigle. I'm the Western Regional Director for Unifor, Canada's largest trade union in the private sector. Unifor represents workers in every sector of the economy, from transit workers in Vancouver to the Suncor oil patch outside Fort McMurray, to the auto giants in southwest Ontario, to forestry workers in Quebec and in the Sunshine Coast, to fish harvesters in Newfoundland and Labrador, and the list goes on. We know what it's like to be at the table and bargain tough deals. Our members in the energy sector across Canada are at the bargaining table right now, fighting for a fair pattern agreement in the face of record corporate profits. All workers and their families in every region have a lot at stake in the fight against climate change and the efforts our governments must undertake to adapt our economy. And that's why we're pleased to be here today for the latest milestone in Canada's net zero journey. It's a journey that many of us in the labour movement have been pushing for a long, long time. It's obvious that there's been thought and consideration in the development of this bill, as we have been calling for. We're most excited to see the creation of a Sustainable Jobs Partnership Council to hear from those who have most at stake. Worker participation will be pivotal to the Council's success, and Unifor expects a seat at the table to share the perspectives of our broad membership. Workers and their unions deserve and expect a voice at the table at all levels. Nothing about us without us. The Sustainable Jobs Secretariat will effectively coordinate action to help workers between ministries. Supporting workers and creating sustainable jobs is work that cuts across all levels of government, and we're pleased there's a mechanism to align these efforts. There are important values that must guide the implementation of this bill in the coming months and years, because we've said for years that this is not just about new jobs. Our economy is undergoing tremendous transformation, and as this happens, workers will need programs and funding to transform many existing jobs. For workers in at-risk industries, they will need income supports, training, skills development, labour market mapping, and mental health supports, and will all have to be efficiently coordinated across many ministries, and communities will need the same support also. Second, as with any plan, talk is cheap. The stakes are simply too high to get the job done without a significant budget. This is an economic transformation, and no worker in any given industry or region should bear the brunt alone of what is ultimately a societal shift. Government can and must act with real funding and support for workers and their communities. As we speak, transitions are going on in various sectors, and this affects our workplaces. The targeted investments, support, and tools are needed right now, not at some unknown point in the future. And finally, we're eager to get to work with the government on concrete measures under an industrial policy that focuses on preserving and promoting good unionized jobs. Policies that tie incentives to union recognition and mandates to recognize and work with unions in all sectors. It's very exciting to see Canada join the ranks of many nations who have legislated a transition plan. It's long overdue, which puts an even greater urgency on getting started now. It wasn't very long ago that I stood here in Ottawa last fall with MP Charlie Angus and Heather Stephenson and Blaikie Desjardins calling for a clean energy plan. This is all part of the same urgent campaign for climate action and good jobs that our National President Lana Payne and the leadership of Unifor have been pushing for quite some time. So in addition to thanking Minister Wilkinson for his leadership on the Sustainable Jobs Act and Minister O'Regan for his support and all the ministers and officials here today, I would also like to give MP Daniel Blaikie a nod for his tireless work to get us where we are. We will always work to ensure that our members and their voices are heard at all levels as we continue this critical economic transformation in the decade ahead. Thank you.
No questions.
The Alberta government had already, anybody can answer it. The Alberta government had already complained about this bill meandering into their jurisdiction, trying to shut down their energy industries. The Premier had put some ultimatums on the table. What do you say to her today about this legislation?
Well, I think I would say a few things. I mean, the first is the language around sustainable jobs is language that she actually has endorsed, that is focused on building an economy for the future that's going to create good jobs and economic opportunity. I think that's something we can all agree on. Certainly, how we do that, it's important that we collaborate. This legislation applies to federal actions, but we certainly are going to be reaching out to encourage our provincial and territorial colleagues to work with us on building these plans. That's what the regional energy and resource tables are about. That's what a number of different things are about. I will actually be in Calgary to meet Premier Smith on Monday, and we will be having an opportunity to talk about how we actually work together to create a bright future for Albertans and all Canadians.
And what do you say about this legislation to the people who are working in the oil patch right now who are worried that the government is coming for their jobs? How is this bill going to change their lives?
Well, I think this bill is going to change their lives in the sense that it is a bill that puts in place an architecture to ensure that building a green economy and ensuring that we are supporting workers along the way is front and center for the government. It's not dissimilar to what we did with the Net Zero Accountability Act, where we have a group of people coming together to provide independent advice to the government to ensure that we are thinking about how we actually make the steps to net zero. In this case, the Partnership Council, which will include a significant number of representatives from labour, from industry, from Indigenous peoples, will be actually a group that will provide advice to us on an ongoing basis to ensure that the interests of workers are at the table in the context of the work that we are doing. I would also, though, say it is important for folks to understand that part of the economic strategy for building a clean economic strategy for this country is about new opportunities, like critical minerals and hydrogen and biofuels and a range of other things. But it's also about ensuring the relevance of Canada's conventional energy resources as we move through what is a decades-long transition. I have said many times that it is in the economic interest of Saskatchewan and Alberta and Newfoundland and Labrador and British Columbia to be aggressively reducing the production emissions associated with oil and gas. I think people like the Pathways folks in Alberta understand that very well, because at the end of the day, it is going to be those that are producing at very low carbon that are going to be the winners in the context of the transition.
Mr. Wilkinson, the news release talks about accountability measures for future governments. Can you help me understand how much teeth that has? What does that mean?
So again, I would reference the Net Zero Accountability Act. This is actually very similar in many respects from an architecture perspective. It is accountability in the context of actually having independent voices at the table providing input. It is accountability in terms of requiring updating the action plans every 5 years and reporting out on progress. It requires that kind of transparency, and the whole point of that is to ensure that Canadians are able to see what is being planned and to actually ensure that governments are taking action on what I think everybody acknowledges are incredibly important issues.
Premier Smith had said in the wake of the report on this that she hoped that there could be future conversations to sort of see if you folks will get on side. I appreciate that you're going to talk to her Monday, but at this point, do you have any reason to believe that she is going to embrace what you are putting out today?
I think we have reason to believe that all provinces and territories can embrace the work that we are doing to build a prosperous economy for the future. And it's not just what we are doing today. It includes the $86 billion that we had in the recent budget about how do we work together to enable provinces to acquire the kinds of companies and enterprises that are going to actually provide the kinds of jobs that we want to see them provide. I used to be a federal-provincial relations specialist for a prairie province. I believe that Canada works best when Canadians work together. I think that there are opportunities to work constructively and collaboratively with Premier Smith, and I look forward to the conversation I will have with her on Monday.
We had a story this morning, the Toronto Star had a story about how climate spending has flowed slower than it said it would in various budgets on various initiatives. Even this legislation that you're tabling today, you guys first promised it 4 years ago. So we're 4 years from promise to just the tabling of what you promised to do 4 years ago. Is the government really acting with the urgency that you talk about that's needed to capture this opportunity of the transition to a low carbon economy and to actually meet our climate goals?
Well, I would say yes, but that's probably not a surprise. Look, the climate change and fighting climate change and reducing emissions, but at the same time being cognizant that as a major oil and gas producer, we have to be thinking about building an economy that's going to provide jobs and economic opportunity for Canadians, has been a priority since we came into office in 2015. It has taken time to get programs ramped up. That is the nature of government. It's also the nature of the fact that we had a government for 10 years previously that did nothing on climate change, and I speak as somebody who was in the clean tech sector as a CEO for almost 20 years. So there are some programs that have taken a little bit longer to get money out the door. COVID had an impact, obviously. COVID had an impact on everything. But I would say that we are enormously ambitious in our targets, in our goals, in the programming that we've rolled out. And some of the programming that we've started to roll out most recently in the budget is actually in a slightly different format, which is it's not programming, it's actually tax credits that are broadly available to all companies, partly because the pace of development just has to go faster.
The reporting we did brought up some concerns from some people that like the machinery of government isn't up to the task of the crisis at hand and the urgency that's needed. What would you say to that concern?
Well, I think in any large organization, this is not specific to government, it's also large companies, you have to be thoughtful and periodically you have to look at the systems and processes that are in place to ensure that you can be as nimble as you possibly can. All bureaucracies sort of ossify over time, and it's important that you are revisiting that. It is something we think about a lot. It's certainly something right now that we're thinking about enormously in the context of looking at how we can make our regulatory and permitting processes more efficient to be able to have critical minerals projects move more quickly and hydrogen projects move more quickly. So I think it is an important question. It's something that governments, to be honest, should be asking themselves each and every year, and it is certainly something that we are focused on right now.
Minister O'Regan.
I'm going to add a few things about Alberta. Friends, you've got a current Minister of Natural Resources here with us today. You've got a former Minister of Natural Resources with us here today. The Labour movement, a whole bunch of ministers, because we're serious about getting to net zero, and we're serious about workers from coast to coast to coast, including Alberta workers being at the heart of that transformation of our economy. And let me tell you a story about a guy named John King, who came up to me as I was handing out flyers in the last election in front of the grocery store in my riding, and he walked right by me. He wouldn't take my flyer. 20 minutes later, he comes back and he says, "That was rude. I assumed you wouldn't talk to me because I'm an oil and gas worker and you're on the red team." I said, "What's your name?" He said, "My name's John." I said, "John, what do you do?" He said, "I work in McMurray." He says, "And I've never talked to a Liberal guy before, or girl." He said, "Tell me that you know that my job matters." I said, "John, not only does your job matter, we're not going to get to net zero without you and all your colleagues." And then he says this. He says, "I know that a change is coming. I know that I can stay in the sector. I'm getting the education that I need. Just tell me that it's not a switch. Tell me that there's a path." And what Jonathan and what Seamus and what the Labour movement and what Charlie and what Dan and the whole government has done is laid out a pathway for the future to get to net zero, because there is no pathway to net zero without Alberta workers. And are the tax credits working? Let's look at the numbers. Our products coming into Northeast Edmonton, $1.6 billion with money from us and money from the Alberta government. And guess what? That's the largest net zero hydrogen plant in the world, the offtake of which is going to produce 20,000 barrels of renewable diesel a day. Why do I care about that, Minister of Tourism? That's going to help us to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in the tourism sector. Heidelberg Materials, within a week of us putting the tax credits in the budget, is going to have the world's largest net zero cement plant, the first in the world. because they're putting a CCUS stack up. So what do we need to do with the government of Alberta? We need to make sure that they're going to come on board fully with carbon capture, use and storage. We need to continue to find common ground. I did this with Premier Kenney. We did this in the first part of Premier Smith's mandate, and we're going to do this systematically moving forward.
But the Alberta Premier has already said that unless you scrapped this legislation, they would not invest more in carbon capture and storage. So how do you convince Alberta to change their mind on that?
I think we can follow the money, and we see where the investments are going, and Alberta is going to continue to lead the country in growth for at least the next 2 to 3 years. And Pathways wouldn't exist and wouldn't be working with us if they didn't see where the puck's going. And this is a government that knows how to skate to where the puck's going, so does industry, and that's why we are working with them to make sure that we decouple emissions from production. And if you can decouple emissions from growth, take a look at the Dow ethylene cracker that we're working on. I was talking with the building trades, and it's 30 million person hours of work. It's the biggest thing we'll build in Alberta since we built upgraders in the oil sands. And so the future is now, and sustainable jobs helps. And look, things that are said before an election may change after an election, and our job is common ground.
Minister O'Regan mentioned misinformation and politics as a potential problem to address. So what's the plan to address those issues to get this legislation through?
Well, from the Alberta context, it's going to sit down and get the work done. And you can see all the collaboration on the dais today in terms of who came to the table to get this legislation done. And we're going to keep working to get it through and make it better and make sure that workers in Alberta and across the country know that there's a clear path to a prosperous future.
Aspect, though, was, I mean, it was part of the Alberta election, right? Danielle Smith was out telling folks that you guys are in cahoots with the NDP to steal their jobs. And here you are standing in front of Canadians with the NDP saying that that is a positive thing. But I wonder how you push back against what was one of the principal messages in her campaign.
I don't know. Read the legislation. What we're talking about here is making sure that workers aren't left behind, but they are, in fact, in the driver's seat. Like, that's what we want to have happen here. And that's extremely important because it is necessary. One thing I learned in my time in natural resources in the middle of COVID and a global price war is that it was all about workers. It's the reason why we developed the Orphan Wells program. It's the reason why we helped support the offshore in Newfoundland. The whole point was because we didn't want to lose workers because we knew this day would come. They are essential. They are the only ones who could look at a pipeline and tell you where you need to tighten up the bolts to make sure the methane doesn't leak. They're the only ones who know how to put up the offshore wind turbines. So it's happening. I mean, I know, based on certain measurements, maybe it's not happening fast enough. Two weeks ago at the now Energy NL conference, they used to be the Oil Industries Association. Now they're Energy NL. I used to give speeches to them. They wouldn't applaud. Now it's very different. And the energy in that room because of offshore wind and hydrogen, it is electric. It is in the billions. It did my heart good, I got to tell you. I have an incredibly low unemployment rate happening in Newfoundland and Labrador right now. I have unions and workers vying for jobs on different projects, and we've only just begun. This is real, and while it may not be fast enough, we just have to keep reminding ourselves, and it's sometimes lost not just here in Ottawa, but in any province where you do not have proximity to the fact that we are the 4th biggest producers of oil and natural gas, 5th in natural gas in the world. You do not turn that economy around on a dime. You do not flip a switch. And the only ones who are going to know how to do it right and properly are workers. So we're not just, this isn't just about talent retention. This is about leading in policy in a very substantive way. That's what this is all about. And in fact, I know some people may look at it cynically that we've rebranded. That we no longer call it just transition. We now call it sustainable jobs, but that is for a very good reason, because frankly, any time I stand up in front of a crowd of workers and say the words just transition, it has become so highly politicized right now, they get whiplash, their heads go back so fast. I need them on side. I'll call it whatever. I really will. The point is we need them on side and we need them engaged, and that's what this legislation will help us do.
Legislation and the ministers today, you're using words like accountability, policy, roadmap. What does this practically mean for the energy worker in Newfoundland, in Fort McMurray? What does this practically mean to them so that they are not sitting there today thinking, this bill is just about putting me out of work?
I say to them, this puts them in the driver's seat. They will lead the energy transition. That's not rhetoric. They're sick of rhetoric. This is going to be law. They will lead the energy transition in Canada.
Does this bill provide
for bilateral agreements with Indigenous nations in cases where the relevant province is not enthusiastic, is not on board with a project, for a nation-to-nation type of engagement?
So this legislation provides, again, let me be clear, this legislation is focused on areas of federal jurisdiction. And the Partnership Council will certainly have Indigenous participation in the Partnership Council. In terms of other mechanisms that engage the provinces, like the regional energy and resource tables, Indigenous participation is one of the key requirements of those tables. Those tables look a little bit different in different parts of the country, but Indigenous participation is one of the things that is required as part of that. In cases where we do not have a table, because there are a few jurisdictions we do not yet have tables established, we will look at ensuring that we are consulting as a federal government directly with Indigenous peoples as well as with industry and labor.
Does that engagement with Indigenous nations look like the way you would consult with any civil society group, or will it be of a different nature?
It will be of a different nature. Again, so the tables themselves are structured a little bit differently in different parts of the country, but I would say, for example, in British Columbia, where it is the most advanced and where we will have something to say within the next couple of weeks in terms of a bit of a status report, it is a fully tripartite process. So. Just one thing to your question, which is, Premier Smith has said that she supports the idea of net zero by 2050. The discussion has to be about the pathways to get there. And so I am very interested in having conversations about ensuring that we're trying to isolate the areas where we don't agree and then find creative ways to actually address those. At the end of the day, I don't think there's any disagreement between myself and the Premier in terms of many of the economic opportunities that are available for Alberta. Alberta, in my estimation, is one of the best advantaged provinces in this country in terms of the opportunities that exist in a lower carbon future. An abundance of critical minerals, hydrogen that can actually be extracted in very low carbon form from natural gas, biofuels, renewable energy, fastest growing renewable energy in anywhere in this country. There are enormous opportunities. I don't think there's any disagreement there.
She's saying it has to be market-driven, and you're saying, I think from your opening comments, that that's a potential road to ruin, right?
I'm not sure she's saying it's entirely market-driven. Certainly in terms of how we actually see the utilization of oil and gas, there is a market there. It's a global market. We have to be sensitive to that. I don't think anybody would say that we don't have to be sensitive to that. But in terms of actually doing the work with respect to reducing emissions, the government of Alberta is very supportive of the work that Pathways is doing. So are we. And I think there's huge scope for participation and collaboration there. So.
Last question.
Pour le Québec, quels secteurs industriels vont être les plus touchés par la transition?
Il y a beaucoup. Particulièrement, le Québec n'a pas un secteur pétrolier et le Québec a un système d'électricité qui est complètement propre maintenant. Mais il y a beaucoup d'opportunités qui viennent avec la transition énergétique, comme les batteries. C'est une priorité pour Premier Legault. C'est l'hydrogène, c'est quelque chose qui est important. Et bien sûr, les minéraux critiques, c'est quelque chose que le gouvernement de Québec veut attaquer et veut avoir une grande participation. Mais je crois qu'avec le Québec, c'est beaucoup d'opportunités et il n'y a pas les enjeux que quelques autres provinces ont, comme quand nous pensons à l'avenir, comment les secteurs va grandir ou va survivre.
Il y a quand même des secteurs polluants quand même, là. Que ce soit des cimenteries ou...
Oui, les cimenteries, c'est...
Des industries particuliers où on va devoir reconvertir des travailleurs.
Oui, le Québec doit réduire le gaz à effet de serre comme tous les provinces et les territoires, mais ce n'est pas le secteur d'électricité, il n'y a pas un secteur pétrolier. Mais bien sûr, l'industrie, et il y a les bons exemples comme aluminium, où il y a beaucoup de travail qui se passe maintenant pour réduire le gaz à effet de serre. Mais bien sûr, le transport, on doit avoir plus de déploiement de véhicules électriques ou zéro émission. Bien sûr, il y a les enjeux, mais ce n'est pas exactement les enjeux que l'Alberta ou le Saskatchewan.
Juste pour préciser, comme ministre Shaman l'avait dit, ministre O'Regan l'avait dit, tous les industries au Québec qui veulent s'adhérer au crédit d'impôt pour soit l'énergie propre, pour les investissements dans le secteur minier ou, par exemple, la cimenterie, ils ont accès à un certain niveau de crédit d'impôt. Mais s'ils veulent avoir tout le pourcentage auquel ils ont accès, avec l'implication des syndicats et avec en payant les gens au niveau qui sont suggérés par les syndicats, là, ils vont avoir accès à tout le crédit d'impôt. Et si on prend l'exemple de Heidelberg Materials, Edmonton, qui est une cimenterie, ils vont mettre une installation de capturation de carbone jusqu'à côté, et c'est à cause de cette installation que cette cimenterie va être capable de produire le ciment carboneutre, premier au monde. Et donc, c'est un bel exemple comment on peut utiliser cette même technologie au Québec et les compagnies vont avoir accès au crédit d'impôt et on va être capable d'atteindre nos objectifs de carboneutralité d'ici 2050.
Merci.